What makes something funny? I recently found an article from the March 2018 Atlantic with that title. And as I started reading it, I expected it to be the typical length of an Atlantic article, only to find myself at the end of it in about 5 minutes, looking to see if there was more hidden just beyond the next block of ads. It appears that it was one of those rare animals you hardly ever see in the wild. A brief Atlantic article. I started to wonder, is that all there is? Is it so short because the answer is so simple? When I went to look up the article a second time, I clicked on the bookmark that I'd left, and I got to one of those pages where you get the first paragraph and the rest of it is all masked off, where they only show you part of the article and try to get you to log in and subscribe to get the rest of it. So I looked at the copy of the Atlantic in my Apple News application, which is basically a photocopy of the magazine in its original layout. It turns out that the original article is one of those little text boxes, kind of like the little boxes in your old social studies textbook that might describe tractors on collective farms in the Soviet Union in the 1950s or whatnot. The article had a different title in its original form. And it was sandwiched between an article about how a major US political party is a threat to democracy and another about the danger of humorless politicians. The short article said that the average adult laughs 18 times a day, yet only about 10 to 20% of the remarks that prompt laughter are even remotely funny. Perhaps Sarah's laughter in today's reading fell in the category of the other 80 to 90%. Maybe she didn't laugh because she thought it was funny, but because what she heard simply sounded ridiculous. Maybe it was a polite laugh at best, or possibly what seems to me like more of a laugh of derision. Perhaps what was actually funny about that text to the original readers was that the eternal one, the one whose name was too holy for them to say out loud, would banter with Sarah over an issue that might be something of a sore spot for her. I heard you laugh. No, you didn't. Oh, yes, I did. Well, Sarah did laugh. And later in the story, she laughed again when her son Isaac was born. In fact, the name she gave Isaac means laughter. Sarah laughs first in derision, yet she laughs last with joy. But the whole notion that the nations of the world will be blessed by the offspring of these two old nomads, that also seems laughable. As does the idea that an insignificant band of slaves might escape their taskmasters, go on a long journey through the wilderness, and create the nation God promised to the nomads, Abraham and Sarah, so many years earlier. And for that matter, how about Jesus sending a band of tax collectors and fisher folk to proclaim to the lost sheep of Israel that the kingdom of heaven is drawing near? It all seems so ridiculous that you just might have to laugh, either awkwardly or derisively, depending on how you feel about the protagonists in the story. One thing that the Atlantic article suggested about humor was that incongruity is one of the things that makes something funny. When certain conventions are undermined by an absurd idea or situation, we might be tickled by the idea. But a corollary to that is also the benign violation theory, that a violation of convention must also be benign. Well, God is in the business of undermining human conventions and expectations. God is in the business of bringing about reversals of fortune, reversals where God's people are vindicated or where they succeed in spite of the original appearances or expectations, even in spite of so many attempts to keep them down. Maybe joyful laughter over that, when it happens, is even better for the soul than merely being tickled by an absurd situation. Now, maybe the danger of humorless politicians is that they are incapable of finding joy in the notion that anyone, be they God or human, might upset the order of things. The order of things so carefully preserved, and what gives those humorless politicians the power to decide who gets what. Looking again at our story for today, it is laughable that God chose Sarah and Abraham, two nomads, to parent a nation by whom the world would be blessed. I also find it a little amusing that God chooses two who are so irreverent. We encounter Sarah's irreverence within the parameters of the story that we read today. But we have to look a little beyond today's reading to find Abraham's irreverence. At what point did Abraham and Sarah figure out that somehow they were talking, when they were talking with one of these three visitors, that meant that they were talking directly with the Eternal One? We don't know. But as they looked down on the plain of Sodom and Gomorrah in the next scene of the story, the Eternal One told Abraham of their intent to investigate the crimes of the two cities that lay before them. Here is Abraham's opportunity to be a little irreverent. If you manage to find 50 righteous people in it, would you sweep away an entire city? No, I will not, responds the Eternal One. And Abraham presses his question even further and further until God agrees to spare the cities, should there be a mere 10 righteous people there. Then the rest of the story is not found in the Revised Common Lectionary. The contrast between how Abraham received the three visitors in today's reading and how the twin cities received the two visitors in the following chapter explains God's grievance with the cities. Conservative scholars these days will reluctantly agree that God's grievance was not about sexual practices, but about their lack of hospitality. That is the contrast between Abraham and the cities. Abraham provided lavish hospitality, but the cities provided the opposite of that. The Midrash says that the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were believed to be paved with gold, but they would flood the entrance of the city to keep strangers and immigrants away. And one rabbinical commentary says this about the traditional Jewish interpretation of the destruction of these cities. The treatment accorded to newcomers and strangers was then and may always be considered a touchstone of the community's moral condition. And if we return to Abraham's irreverent negotiation with the Eternal One over the fate of the cities, we might notice that the Eternal One ends the conversation once Abraham has negotiated down to 10 righteous souls in the city. This conversation suggests another concept from traditional Jewish interpretation, that in the midst of so much corruption, the merit of a small number of righteous people can save a much larger community. That might also be the connection between the fact that the negotiation ended at 10. For the rabbinical tradition of 10 is the minimum quorum required for communal worship. And the tradition suggested that if a few could not find 10 people in the city willing to listen for the voice of the divine, then they should probably move on. And I might suggest that Jesus might have even thought that number could be lowered to 2 or 3 when he said, "Where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am there with them." The whole point of this is about the merit of the few. It's laughable that God's promise to 2 nomads, that their offspring would bless the nations of the world. Yet they did, and they still do. While insignificant in number, the Jewish people have always had an impact on the world around them that exceeds mere numbers. And we should also expect that our presence, our willingness to welcome the stranger, our willingness to speak on behalf of those who are ignored and derided will pay off too. Our voices will be heard. Our faithfulness will transform our community. When we say no to hate speech, what we do matters. When we say no to lies about the huddled masses yearning to breathe free, what we do matters. When we say yes to hospitality, when we say yes to the stranger, when we say yes to the outcast, when we say yes to fair treatment for all God's people, when we say yes to the dignity of all God's people, we are the ones standing in the way of destruction. If it seems irreverent to some, then that's what God chose us for. If that is a laughable claim, then let us continue to work for the day when we will laugh with joy. That is what God's people do. God's people persist. God's people believe in God's steadfast love. And God's people will laugh with joy when God's justice and God's peace prevail.